welcome to NAPOD, where we provide NA speaker meetings and workshops in a podcast. We are an ad-free podcast, and if you enjoy listening, please help us to be self-supporting by visiting napod.xyz, look for the donate link, and drop $1 or $2 in the virtual basket. If you're also in AA or have friends that are, please tell them about our other podcast, Sobercast. Sobercast features AA speakers and workshops in the same format as NAPOD. We upload a new speaker every day, and it's easy to subscribe by searching for Sobercast, that's 2 words, on any podcast player app, or go to Sobercast.com. Enjoy the podcast, and thanks for listening.
I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Annie F. from Auckland, New Zealand.
Hi, my name's Annie. I'm an addict. And it's really neat to be here. I don't come from Auckland, but I guess that would be somewhere people might know. I actually come from across the harbour in a little place called the Coromandel, which is beautiful oceanside, but very small population. So my fellowship meetings are pretty small, and until recently we didn't have NA. And actually when I moved there were no 12-step fellowship meetings at all, and there were a couple about an hour away. So I found some other people that were keen, and we started first an AA meeting and then recently NA. And I would go to NA in Auckland when I visited there. But when I first got clean, there were lots of NA meetings, and that's where I started my recovery. I started using at the age of 14, and I'd had some childhood trauma and the loss of a mother figure, my grandmother, who'd raised me essentially for the first 5 years of my life, died, and I was diagnosed with anxiety and went to my family physician with my mum and was prescribed benzos, and neither of those things made me an addict, but what it gave me was a whole lot of feelings I didn't know how to handle, and a drug that took them away. And so from that moment onwards, I was hooked. And I pretty much, I don't consider myself a prescription pill addict because I never used it as prescribed. Not in the doses, not in the frequencies, not in the combinations, and I went on, and in the end they weren't even prescribed, they were stolen. So I never call myself a prescription pill addict, and I added other things as it went along. I went to my first NA meeting at 21, and it was a threat from the love of my life at that time that if I didn't clean up my lifestyle, he would leave. So I went to an NA meeting. I'm not sure how I even knew about NA, and I was certainly the youngest person there, and there was nothing in me that allowed me to relate to what people were sharing. And I, halfway through, I just thought, fuck this, and I left. And I went home to the love of my life, and he said, how'd it go? And I just said, they're a bunch of losers. And I just said to myself, fuck this, I'm out of here. And he just looked at me and he said, well, fuck this, I'm out of here. And he left. And I was devastated, but it was probably the kindest thing that he could have done because it brought me to my knees, actually. And I went things went downhill from there for me. I got into recovery at 26, and I've just celebrated 15 years clean. Thank you. I am only alive through the grace of an anonymous taxi driver who found me an overdose. I trained as an RN, which was an interesting career choice, and gave me huge access. But I was at my 3rd year formal ball in my training, and I was all about the dosing, and I got the dosing very wrong that night. And I passed out underneath a flax bush in this beautiful ball gown covered in vomit, and in New Zealand, in the South Island, it's freezing cold, so I was severely hypothermic, and it's probably what kept me alive because the taxi driver, he said I was barely breathing. So he put me in a heated taxi van and he took me to hospital, where I was brought around by varying means and looking into the eyes of people that I was training with. And it was the height of humiliation for me. You know, as an act, I worked really hard at keeping my life very separate, all the compartments, like my work life, my family life, my using friends, my normal friends. And there were moments like that where two walls came down, and it was terrifying. But you know what? I was never questioned. You know, I was never drug tested. It never went any further, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. I finished nursing school, and I went into a very full-on specialty into the ER, and loved it. Loved the adrenaline, loved the pace, and when that show Nurse Jackie came to New Zealand, I just thought that was me. But I was a younger version. I was arrogant. I believed I knew what was right for other people. I could handle very highly stressful situations very well because I was loaded on benzos, and I never felt anxiety. You know, it was always praised for coping, but I never did it straight, and that was just how I did it. I had other nurses that covered me, that I gravitated towards other nurses that had addiction, basically, and they would cover my ass. I was one of the youngest in the ER, and they looked out for me. After my partner left me, I decided that studying, getting more qualifications might fix that gaping hole inside, so I went to university to study psychology, and I was working full-time, night shifts, and studying during the day, and I just used drugs to keep me awake, to put me to sleep. I would party, and I didn't eat, I didn't sleep, I was just an absolute wreck, but still, I managed to pull off a high grade point average because I wanted to go into graduate school. And just before my final exams, one of my last remaining normal friends sat me down, and I was bitching and moaning. I was so resentful of my family. You know, I have three younger sisters who are really normal. They're not affected by addiction. I was incredibly resentful of their normal lives, and I was complaining, and I was just an absolute wreck. And anyway, she sat me down and essentially did an intervention, but she didn't know that I used. She just saw the insane behaviour, and she said to me, if you continue the way you are, you're going to have a psychotic break, and you're not going to come out of it. And she said, rather than sit your exams, I think you should go to hospital. And she wasn't talking rehab, she was talking a psych hospital. And she'd spoken to my family, who were very willing to pay to send me to New Zealand's only private psychiatric hospital to spare me the humiliation of seeing further colleagues in the psych ward. And I was like, no way. I mean, there was a part of me that thought to actually step out of the insanity of my life would be okay. But I knew that I'd go through one hell of a withdrawal, and I thought, no. And I don't know how I got out of it. I would have bullshitted my way out of it. I sat my finals and did really well, but realised I needed, to just settle down. Life was really, really crazy, and I got this amazing job offer, and my higher power has a real sense of humour because it was in New Zealand's only 12-step based alcohol and drug residential treatment facility, and what I thought I was taking there I will never know, apart from active addiction. And that, again, I wasn't screened for addiction. I was never drug tested. I remember being asked a couple of questions, and I just lied. And so I went there, and I was running my own groups, and I had my own clients, and I was loaded the whole time. And but some of what people were sharing went in. I didn't think I had addiction. I thought I had a lot of problems, which was true too. But I was still really, really defending the concept that I was an addict as well. But I'd been there a while, and a lot of the staff were in recovery, and the two staff that I really looked up to were the physicians, and one of them was like me. He was a pill addict, and I talked to him a lot about how to get off benzos, thinking it was, he was thinking I was talking about other people, but I was talking about myself, and he told me how to do it, and so I started to taper myself down. But what I did was I just used other drugs more. so I just went from one to the other. And that was a full-on time. And anyway, I was invited to a party, and I thought, I'm not going to use because I've got to work the next day and it's going to look really uncool going there. Really messed up, and I got to the party, was offered something within 10 minutes and had absolutely no ability to say no, and used more than I ever had, and pretty much had that psychotic break that my friend predicted. My partner that had left me, he went into the SAS, which is like the Navy SEALs, and that night I bumped into one of his friends, and I thought they were still, that they were like going to shoot me, that I could see them running around. I was in the centre of Christchurch in the South Island, and I really believed that they were, going to kill me that night. And it was only that I was out with other nurses and psychologists that they got me through that night. And I went to work the next day absolutely sick and in withdrawals, and I got there, I was on an afternoon shift, and my colleague said to me, "You're not running groups, you're not seeing clients, you just stay in the office, you look terrible." And so I did. And anyway, one of my clients came out of group and needed some headache medication, and I was so ill that I couldn't pop the Tylenol out of the foil packets. And he just looked at me and he said, "Have you been using?" And I can tell you every lie that I'd ever told was available right there for me. And this was the start of my spiritual awakening, I guess, and I, for the first time, told the truth. And I said, "Yeah, I have been." And he said, he was Australian, he said, "Mate, you're fucking lucky." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, you can use and party and not end up in shithole rehabs like this." And I said, yeah. And he walked out the door, I shut the door, and I slumped into a seat and put my hands, my head in my hands, and I don't know how long I sat there. And it was like my higher power continued to speak to me, or that's what I identify as it today, and in my own language, the words, "Who the fuck are you trying to kid?" And finally I had that moment of clarity, and it was like my step one in pictures of my using just went in front of me, and the devastation in my life that I'd caused myself and others, and I was pretty devastated by that. And anyway, my colleague came back in, she's like, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Oh my God, I think I'm an addict." And she just laughed. And she said, "We all know you're a fucking addict." And this was another God job. I'd trained with her, so she'd seen me for 3 years, like totally messed up at nursing school. And I didn't know, but she was a long-term Al-Anon, and her partner was in another 12-step program. And so they knew. And I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And she said, "It would have made no difference." And she's right. And so she said, "I want you to go to a meeting." And I'm like, "No, I can't, I'm working." She said, "Yeah, like you're really doing a lot of work." And and she said, "I want you to," this was the best advice ever. She said, "You go to an NA meeting," and she said, "You listen as a sick addict, not as a professional." Because I was really good at the professional bit. I was interested in addiction as long as it wasn't my own. And so I went there and I heard it. I heard a message of hope, and there were other health professionals there, and there were other people my age there, even though I still felt really young. But a woman came up to me, and she said, "You don't remember me?" She was a real stroppy older addict. And I said, "No, I don't." And she said, we worked in the same hospital. I was in the recovery ward, and she said, "I knew you needed this program." And I was like, fuck, is there no one that didn't know that I had a problem? But, my friend that worked with her and her colleague was found, she was caught stealing drugs, and she suicided. And so I knew that it was serious. And she said, "Unless you do this shit, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your licence." And so in some ways that fear drove me initially, but hey, whatever works, and it kept me going. And anyway, that meeting actually then became my home group, and she said to me, "Get a sponsor," and I got a sponsor. And like, there are not that many Americans in New Zealand, but she was American, this woman, and her husband came from San Diego. They were both in the program, and they had no family in New Zealand, so they took me in like their little Kiwi daughter, and they taught me how to be. He ran the treatment facility, and they taught me about how to be a sober clean woman. And she talked to me a lot about home group. I really hadn't heard that before. She said, get a meeting, and basically she was talking about commitment, and that was something that I shied well away from. And she said, I want you to sit up the front. She said, I want you to share when you're asked. I was like, oh my God. And she said, I want you to do service. She said, I want you to welcome newcomers. And I'm like, well, I am the newcomer. She said, there'll be newer people than you coming in. And, and she said, the important bit is that you get to know people. But she said, more, crucially, you let people know you. And that was the bit that made my heart flip. It was like, I never let anyone know me. I had so many masks. I was such a chameleon. I was just whoever I was with, what I thought people wanted me to be. And so that freaked me out. And she had a real simple message, and that message is still with me now. I don't have any secrets to recovery. It was just don't pick up no matter what happens. She said, because shit will happen in recovery. And she was right. And she said, just keep going to meetings and work the steps. And that's what you have to do on a daily basis. And that hasn't changed in 15 years. And so this home group, basically taught me life on life's terms. I saw people get married, I saw people have children, I saw people get sick with cancer, I saw people die, I saw women have miscarriages, I saw everything, and I learnt about how to deal with this stuff, and I saw other people not using over what, things that seemed really catastrophic. And I started to thaw out emotionally, and it was the first couple of years was kind of rough. But I remember, so I followed her rules, and it seemed like every week I was asked to share, and I absolutely fucking hated sharing. I was really anxious, like with benzos out of my system, I was just anxiety plus. And it seemed like every week they would ask me to share, and I don't know what I'd say, and I'd sit down and I'd just go back over what I'd said and be like, oh my God. And then I was about 2 years clean, I suppose, and my sponsor was in the chair, and she asked me to share, and I shared, and something felt different, and I was sharing, and I was looking at my home group, and they started grinning at me, like real crazy grinning, and I'm like, what are they doing? And I kept sharing. And then some of them stood up and started clapping, and I'm like, man, I'm not saying anything good here, I don't know what they're doing. And I said to my sponsor who was in the chair, what's going on? And she said, that is the first time you've looked up when you've shared. She said, we've never seen your face. It's just like, I was like this. And I wasn't just like that sharing, I was like that if I was talking to you one-on-one. And I'd always been like that. And it was, my home group knew me really well, and they picked up a change in me before I even knew it. And actually at that point, around 2 years, things started to get a little easier. And I started to be able to deal with life on life's terms a bit better. And if I'd been at any other meeting, no one probably would have even noticed that point. But my home group had a lot of real old timers in it, and it also had people around my age and in between, and there was a big group of us that was sort of between kind of 1 and 5 years, and we all hung out together, we socialised together, we travelled to conventions together. I flattered with one of the women in my home group. So we were really tight, and we went through ups and downs and resentments and all sorts of crap, but we learnt how to stay in relationship even though we had difference and conflict, and that was not something I knew how to do, and it was awesome. It was awesome. And we'd get huge resentments with each other. I remember one of my best friends in my home group coming out of a meeting and saying in front of everybody, and I'm sure he meant it as a joke, but I didn't take it as a joke. He said, your sharing is so boring, I could make a meditation tape out of it and go to sleep in 5 seconds flat. I was like, everyone laughed. I stormed off and refused to talk to him for at least a month. So stuff like that happened all the time. But, my sponsor taught me how to deal with that. I'm sure he was joking. I mean, maybe it was really boring. I don't know. I did a lot of bitching and moaning about my age. But that was all good. But, other amazing things that happened. I worked in the community there in trauma again, and went through, at 15 months clean, I went back into my, chosen career, but it was in a community setting this time, so it was a bit different. But doing it clean was so different. I was no longer that gung ho ER nurse. It was real, and one of our local children drowned in our river, and I knew that child, and I was involved in a resuscitation with that child's dad next to me, and it was devastating to me at that time. And I remember coming back from that and just not knowing what to do with that amount of feeling. And I just went and sat on my home group meeting the steps outside it. I sat there for hours, at least 4 hours. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't talk about what I'd gone through because there were issues of confidentiality. I couldn't talk. I was just numb and blown away. And anyway, my home group members eventually came along, and they'd heard actually, and they took me inside and they gave me cups of tea. They never asked what happened. They knew, and they saw that I was a mess. And anyway, my sponsor's husband came along, and my sponsor she was back in the States visiting family, and he knew what had happened, and he shared, and he was in the Navy here in San Diego, and he'd been in the Vietnam War, and he'd seen children die. And he shared about that, and about that incredible empty hole that left with him. And he totally understood where I was coming from, and allowed me to cry in that meeting and share about what had happened for me, how it had affected me, not the details of what had happened. And I didn't use, which was a miracle. Normally I would have. And yeah, it's this is a little bit more painful. One of my recovery sisters, and she was a sister to me. We got clean together. She was actually my client, but I left the treatment facility, and she stayed in the community and became a member of our home group, and we were really, really close. And she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she was only 32, so sort of 5-6 years into our recovery, and she moved away, but we were still really close. And she got this devastating diagnosis of breast cancer, and she got through that initial illness and had a lot of treatment, and she advocated for Herceptin to be funded in New Zealand, but didn't actually reap the benefits of that. She was a very, very dynamic woman, and very involved in the fellowship, and amazing example of recovery for me. And anyway, she moved down to where I was living, and met one of my newer home group members, and they fell in love. And so she lived there again, so we were back in the same home group, and she got pregnant, which was a miracle after what she'd been through. And at the end of her pregnancy, I went and visited her, and she could hardly walk, and I said, something's wrong. This isn't normal pregnancy. And she said, I know. And she went to hospital, and her cancer had come back. And so her baby was delivered, and she was basically having radiotherapy at the same time and chemotherapy not long after. And we were all absolutely devastated. But she really pulled on the love of the fellowship, and it was certainly there for her, because she'd certainly done a lot for the fellowship in terms of giving. I moved away to where I'm now working in the Coromandel, but she would come up to a Buddhist retreat centre there, and we'd spend some really neat time there with her little baby and her partner. And very sadly, this was only sort of 3 or so months ago, she, just before her wee boy turned 2, she died. And it was probably one of the bigger challenges for me. It was a death. I've seen tons of death in my work, but her death affected me very differently. It was really hard to accept that she had died. It still is, actually. And I needed to fly back to my hometown to go to her funeral, and I was terrified of that intense grief. And I didn't know how I was going to get through her funeral. And so I took my mum and my sister, and we went into the little church in my hometown, and sitting there right in front of me was my whole home group. And I hadn't even considered that they would all be there. And all of my home group, bar one, are all still clean. and I sat in the middle of them, and I hadn't seen them for a little while, but it didn't matter. And no one needed to say anything. Like, we were all going through this thing together, and we were all incredibly sad about her death. And, you know, during the service, when things got really rough, I would just feel someone's hand on my shoulder. And I was able to do that when I saw other people get really devastated too. And, we made it through that service. And it was an incredible, for me, just the power of a home group. You know, that I knew them really well and they knew me really well, and there were no words that were needed, and we were just there, you know. All the good and the bad and the ugly we'd all been through together. And, you know, when it really came down to it, we were all there. And after the meeting, when we were having a cup of tea and stuff, we all sat around and shared and about her life and how we were all feeling. And it was, it really epitomised for me that value. So if you're new to Narcotics Anonymous, you know, a home group is just, it's a really special thing. And you know, it's about commitment, and it's about love, and it's about showing up and being accountable, letting people know you, getting to know them, welcoming the newcomer, and being of service. And I think, you know, that's where I did my service, was with my home group, most of my service, and it was phenomenally helpful. So it's... for me, this past year has been a huge growth time for me. I separated from my husband a year ago, and almost to the day, and really had to look deep at why I chose to stay with someone that was so abusive. And I've really had to learn to love myself for the first time. You know, there's some things come quickly in recovery in terms of growth, and other things that take time, and the stuff has taken time for me. But, you know, I've got a new home group now, and they're just as loving and supportive. And starting up this new meeting, I felt like, you know, I'm doing service, but, you know, the first meeting, I'm just bawling my eyes out, and I'm getting more than anybody else. And it was just such a relief, especially a relief for me to have an NA meeting locally again. Huge relief. And it was my NA friends in Auckland that put the challenge out there for me. I'd been kind of thinking about it. And yeah, it was the best thing that I could have done for myself, and I'm pleased that it's available to my community as well, and the word's getting out there, which is awesome, because it's the cannabis growing centre of New Zealand where I live. It's and a lot of, we call it P, but I think you guys call it meth. And there's a lot manufactured where I am, and so NA is. I'm really pleased. It's, you know, we're there, and we've got this amazing. It just, from the thought that I had about starting a meeting to someone saying you should do it, to finding someone else to help me, to finding a venue, was like 2 weeks, and we were up and running. And we've got this beautiful. It's like a pyramid, and it's been constructed. It's like where I live is real hippie central. Like hippies, like communes, and so there's all these really neat places, and it's like this pyramid with glass roof, and we have our meeting in there, and it's beautiful, and the sun shines, and it's in the middle of like a native forest, and it's just a really special place. And we've had visitors come saying they've been to NA meetings all around the world, but they've never been to such a beautiful venue, and it's just really special, and it's just so fantastic to have that there now. And we made it, you know, we made it to suit ourselves, me and another member who are always there during the day. We both have a child, so it works really well. All of our meetings pretty much are at night, which sometimes can be hard for women with young children. So, but we're starting to attract newcomers now, and it's really neat, and doing a bit of going around talking to other health professionals and stuff. So I've sort of had to out myself in my community a bit, and that's been okay. It's been okay. And in fact, I had a job performance appraisal recently, and my boss said, you know, one of the good things about you, Annie, is your recovery, you know, and I've never had that Never had that come up in the workplace. In fact, I used to go to performance appraisals and just shit myself thinking they're going to find out I've been stealing fucking drugs. And I didn't hear anything they said about what I could or couldn't do or anything. I was just sitting there waiting for it, and it never ever came. And now the performance appraisals, I'm happy to hear the feedback, the areas that I need to work on. But, having a normie say that, was awesome. And, I don't take any credit for that. I've had so much support in my recovery. And I love my work now. I get to race around in the ambulance. I'm based in a clinic, but I also train as a paramedic, and I get to drive really fast, and I still do all the stuff I love. And, I was at something really horrific the other night. Someone that was using and stepped out in front of a truck. And amazingly, he survived. But I was called in and I got in the back of the ambulance, and there was just high adrenaline amongst the rescue workers, amongst the other ambulance officers and fire, because he was actually a local firefighter, and they were there, and it happened directly outside the fire station. So it was, and I went in there, and I was able to find that calmness inside of myself that drugs used to give me in those situations, and I just was able to centre myself and do what I needed to do without getting caught up in the adrenaline myself, and able to support my colleagues to calm down and feel like they're doing the best they could in this situation. But because he was one of our own, it was more difficult for them. I think they knew him very well, and actually one of them had got me to talk to him about the program because they knew he had. So I knew him from that situation, and I just pray that he finds, his rock bottom soon. It's being hit by a truck, I would say, is pretty close, but my near-death experience didn't bring me here. It was quite a few more years after that before I came here. But in New Zealand, I'll just finish with this. In New Zealand, we have our Indigenous culture, which are the Maori people, and where I live and work, I work in amongst the communities there. There's 3 very traditional communities, and their language really is a very beautiful language, and there's quite a few Maori in recovery, coming into recovery, which is fabulous because their rates of addiction is very high in proportion to their numbers in our country. But I was talking with one the other day, and he was sharing with me about how, I was talking to him about home group, about how he thinks about home group, and this is what he said. There's 3 words, and the first one is aroha, which loosely translates to love, but not romantic love, like compassion and caring, that kind of love. And he said the other one is wairua, which means spirit. So spiritual. And the third one, which is hugely important in the Maori culture, is whānau, which directly translates to family. And but not just blood family, family in its widest context. And so, he said that recovery for him is like finding the love of a spiritual family. And I really loved that. And that's what it is for me too. So, yeah. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Annie. I would like to... there we go. I'd like to thank our speakers, Ken K. and Annie F. Thanks for...
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please help us improve our ranking so others can find us by putting a review on Stitcher, iTunes, or your favorite podcast index. Napot is ad-free thanks to the folks supporting the show with $1 or more per month. If you enjoy listening, you can join them by going to napot.xyz and looking for the donate link. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.